Africa will continue to work with other African partners to push for a common global agenda in tackling COVID-19. International Relations and Cooperation Minister Naledi Pandor has emphasized the need for a fair and equitable global governance system. She has told a recent webinar that South Africa supports multilateralism and appreciates the important role the United Nations played in the struggle against apartheid. The need to re-establish trust in multilateral institutions was also raised by the South African Institute of International Affairs CEO Elizabeth Sidiropoulos at the same webinar. She joins us now to further unpack her views about the importance of multilateralism and South Africa's role in it. Elizabeth, good evening. Welcome to South Africa tonight. Why is finding common ground important in today's world?
Good evening, Dan, and good to be with you. Well, you know, if we just think about all of the challenges that we're facing at the moment, of which COVID is probably the most immediate, but as your previous news clip also showed, we're dealing with water crises, not just in South Africa, but across the world. We're dealing with climate catastrophes, floods, and so on. I mean, these are big challenges that cannot be handled or dealt with by one country alone or by a group of countries. This really needs the world to come collectively together to actually chart a way forward. And now we've tried to do a lot of that, but I think the pressure is mounting. And this is what I think the UN Secretary General was talking about also this week. The pressure is mounting. We're running out of time, and we really, really need to develop not just common agendas, but common actions that we're actually then able to act on. And one of the big challenges of the last 5 or 6 years is that we have a great ambitious global frameworks, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Climate Agenda, both from 2015, but our ability to move quickly on all of those fronts has really been hampered by sort of very narrow self-interest.
Yeah, and we've seen that. We've seen those very narrow self-interests manifesting themselves during this COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, the COVID-19 global response, as you said at the webinar, has been, to say the least, problematic. Now, in that regard, is a universal social contract possible? Well, you know, what the UN does is it sits at the apex of the multilateral system, and it has both an ambitious charter and an aspirational approach to some of the biggest global challenges. And so what we do have to constantly aim for, even in this rather fraught, polarized global climate at the moment, is we have to look to how we can do things better. We have to create dialogues, platforms, ideas about how we can come together. So an ambitious universal social contract is both what I mentioned in the webinar, but also something that the UN Secretary General spoke about. It's about recognizing that poverty in one place or inequality in one place doesn't necessarily stay in one place, doesn't necessarily only impact one place. In the same way that the COVID pandemic, if you don't deal with it everywhere, you're actually not dealing with it anywhere. Yeah. And it's that perspective, that perception that requires us to come together and agree on principles for the road going further, a universal social contract. But for that to be possible, you need an equitable and a fair governance system. I mean, Minister Naledi Pandor in that webinar pointing out that the way the United Nations is structured today is ancient. It needs to be modernized. You have a Security Council dominated by a few rich countries, and it can't carry on like it's still in 1945.
Yeah, absolutely. So the fundamental, the foundation of any effective global governance multilateral system is the ability to respect it, to have trust in it, to regard it as legitimate. So this has been a call that South Africa has been making, and many other developing countries have been making for a long time, that we respect and hold highly the UN and the role it has played, both historically and the role that it can play in the future. But it needs to be reformed, that what it is now is not sufficient. I think that is beginning to dawn
on also many countries in the north. The big challenge here is reforming, of course, the Security Council and getting the countries, the permanent 5, who sit on the Security Council and wield the veto, to actually either relinquish it or to broaden the membership, the permanent membership, and that continues to be a stumbling block. One of the challenges, I think, for countries like South Africa and indeed for the African continent is to think of ways, together with maybe partners in other parts of the world, of how we break that, how we help to break that impasse, to really push at the Security Council for reform. The other dimension, which the Minister also referred to, is it's important to look at strengthening the role of the UN General Assembly in that regard, particularly on issues of peace and security. The difficulty there is that you're dealing with, nearly 200 countries, and if it's difficult to get consensus within a 15-member Security Council, it is, equally even more difficult to get consensus within the General Assembly. But that ultimately is the most legitimate organ within the UN.
Yeah, finally, Elizabeth, I need to ask you this. In a world where it's a reality that we have geopolitical rivalries, we have some regional institutions, look at SADC, for example, and South Africa has got a very important role that it plays there. How best can South Africa use its influence to enable some of these aspects of this much-needed global social contract, as you call it, or much-needed multilateralism that is fair and equitable?
So clearly it's South Africa's continued engagement and I think, leadership role, being very active in global governance fora, the UN, not just the UN, the WTO, for example, our proposal together with India for an IPR, intellectual property rights waiver on the TRIPS agreement around vaccines. The role we have played also within the UN in highlighting the importance of the link between UN on peace and security issues and regional bodies such as SADC, etc., the African Union. These are all important agenda-setting approaches. So putting items on the agenda to broaden the debate. The next stage, or part of that sort of getting our voice out there and helping to shape reform, is also developing alliances, coalitions, and so on, which has happened. And this is about doing it not just within Africa, but also across North and South. So not just in the developing world, but also partnerships with countries that are like-minded about the importance of reform in Europe, North America, and so on. And it's really about using different fora, whether it is the G20, where we've also tried to bring a stronger African voice and putting issues on the table, and I think that has been to some extent effective. Because those smaller groupings act as conduits for agendas to make it into the more formal multilateral bodies such as the WTO, the UN, and so on.
Elizabeth Sidiropoulos, thank you very much for your time on this Thursday evening here on South Africa Tonight.